And I also want to thank a lot of my old friends who are out here tonight. A lot of us are old comrades in the struggle, and I know it's like way past your bedtime. So we'll try to get the show going now. Our first presenter is Carolyn Malin Marr, and she is a fabulous poet. You're going to hear it for yourself. She's a high school teacher. She graduated with a Master's of Fine Arts from Warren Wilson College. She's part of the Rabo Collective. Some of her writings are in the journal over there at Calix, and also she's been published in Cimarron Review and New England Review. But the reason why I really wanted Carolyn to be up here tonight is poetry has this power to kind of unlock a window into first the mind of the poet, how the poet is feeling, but really good poetry triggers whole waves of emotion in your own head, and it brings you to places that you've been to in the past, places you want to go to in the future. That's really the power of poetry. And I know there are other poets in the audience tonight. I hope we can do more programs with poets and music, but right now I want you to meet Carolyn Malin Marr.
Hi, y'all. Thanks. I'm Carrie, and I want to start with some gratitude. I'm a high school teacher, I had to. I want to start with some gratitude. I want to thank Eddie Wong and Eastwind Ezine for putting this event together and inviting me to be part of it. I want to thank Charlie Chin, who's going to be performing next, and my ancestors and all of the Gumsan ancestors for making what must have been a pretty overwhelming journey to get here. I also want to do a special acknowledgement to the fact that tonight we're sitting in occupied Ohlone territory, specifically Chochenyo Ohlone in what's now known as Oakland. This land, the Bay Area, is my home, and while I'm grateful for it, I recognize that my notions of home come at a pretty high price, which is settler colonialism. And I just want to recognize that the Ohlone were and are still here. And on that same note, I also want to acknowledge and thank the ancestors and current members of the Washoe Tribe of Nevada and California, the indigenous inhabitants of the Lake Tahoe Basin, and especially the Washoe Cultural Resource Advisory Council for their support and collaboration on some of my work. And of course, thank you to all of you for being here tonight, and to Eastside Cultural Center. So tonight I'm going to read 6 poems, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and my process in between. All of this work is connected to a second book manuscript that I'm currently working on, which is a collection of poems that explores questions of inheritance, colonization, language, family, and nature. And the focal points of the narrative are the landscape of Lake Tahoe and the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad, mostly by Chinese labor, in the 1860s. And this first poem I'm going to read was inspired by a line in a book about Lake Tahoe, which is the epigraph of the poem. Tragedy. One of the Chinese had been skewered by an iron brake rod and was screaming for somebody to shoot him. E.B. Scott, The Saga of Lake Tahoe. I think of the white man who lived after an iron rod, also from the railroad, also a brake rod, perhaps, speared him right through his brain. Medical marvel. The conflicting accounts of whether or not the injury caused personality change. Early neurology, psychology, his daguerreotype affixed in the gilt-framed textbooks of our memory. It is unclear whether the Chinese was or was not shot. Whether he survived was too a marvel with a hole in his gut, or was it? No, had to be gut. To skewer is to be food, gutted. The screaming implies not lungs nor throat. And the heart, well, death already. I have screamed for somebody to let me die, but no one had a gun. I was asking not to be saved. Oh, girl child, sadness, epigenetic thread, disappointment stitched to every story. In a different book, I read that the Chinese had gunpowder hundreds of years before we put it to guns. The Maya with wheels, the author's comparison. When a tool's not worth the change it rings. All fireworks, no grenades, firecrackers without the cracking of bullet, just crush of knuckle to bone, iron to rib. What interested the teller in this story was not the story's inevitable end, a body, dead one way or another, bones shipped home for burial, a pallet box, or my father coming home through customs. What you got in that suitcase, son? My grandmother, he chuckles with each retelling. We visit her every year, one of 6 names on a stone. The index, too, lists 6 mentions of the Chinese in 468 pages. Caroline is the name of a boat, one of 162 indexed. Home is where your living will honor you as long as they remember you, a mean old woman. A skewering tongue in my father's childhood, bitterness. Either way, I know the man in the story is dead. Crawl of infection, loss of blood, shouting recoil of mercy. Somebody's. It's been too long for a miracle. The water is meant for the rush of the hull. It doesn't count each dive. 144 years, waiting for someone to call his name. Thanks, y'all. So, as I started writing these poems, one challenge that came up was translation. I've always used a lot of vernacular speech and multiple languages in my poetry because I'm interested in having my speakers use language in ways that make their identities, whether racial, cultural, gender, sexual, ethnic, linguistic, and so on, visible on the page. But now I want to use languages other than English without always translating for my presumably English-speaking reader. And the problem with that is I'm a really lousy Cantonese speaker, and I'm functionally illiterate in Chinese. So I went to immersion elementary school, and then I had Chinese tutors until I was 18, and I spent a few months in Hong Kong studying when I was in my 20s, and I rarely use Cantonese. Basically, I only use it to order food. Yeah, much English speakers. And I never read it. So when I came across this term water guest in Jean Felser's book, Driven Out, I knew the English translation only as she presented it. Water guests were the people who carried letters back and forth between California and China. The term was so beautiful, and it also felt like this in-between identity that I wanted to explore. And I knew already the translation for water, so I could even write it. It's like a 2nd grade word. But I'd never used the word guest in my entire broken Cantonese speaking life. And unfortunately, my dad's Chinatown street Cantonese, also illiterate, sorry Dad, not so helpful. So Google. Now I know the character for guest, it's that second one. But Google is Google and Mandarin hegemony. So I ended up writing 3 poems about my journey to try to fucking figure out how to pronounce this second character, this word for guest, and this word that was like a mystery to me, even as its meaning was known. So this next poem is one of those 3. It contains a fair amount of untranslated Cantonese, so if you're not a Cantonese speaker, just enjoy the sounds. And if you are a Cantonese speaker, I'm sorry about my accent, and I hope you get the joke that I snuck in here. Guest, second translation. Months later, I will ride down the wide boulevards of my city with 2 strangers and a driver, the age of my father, same receding black hair, but lacking the milk-tall stance and orthodontia smile of the American-born, thus reminding me more of the generation before. The strangers don't speak, staring at their phones. as is the custom. I stare at his name, turning its tone in my closed mouth. It could be Chi or even Chi, but who would name their child Chi, really? I won't speak until the strangers both leave the car, mouth careful. My father grew up in Chinatown, and how long have you lived here, Chi? Deciding to go for tone 1 like an optimistic song on my tongue, and he asks me, do I speak Guangdonghua? And I say Mo Gam Do, and he says he thinks it's better living in the Richmond than crowded Chinatown. And yes, the Richmond is a lot like the Sunset where I grew up, which is when it occurs. Maybe he can answer. So at the next red light, I pull up my ghost words and say, I know, sorry, but I don't know this second one. Can you help me? And he says, oh yes, his silver bridge flashing delight at the shore of his lip. That soy hak means someone who travels back and forth like a merchant or an importer-exporter, says it a few times for me to practice in my wobbly hak, hak, hak accent until I get it right. Hak. I say it used to mean the people who carried your letters home when no one could leave or come here. And he says, sure, it's still a lot like that. They still use it for those who go back and forth between here and there, carrying what anyone needs.